Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bible in Context. How's it going, Nate?
Doing well, Caleb. How are you?
Doing good. Ready to dive into typology. I think it's a really fun subject.
I'm sure everybody's just at the edge of their seat, ready to go.
Now they're about to go to sleep. Regretting having tuned in at this point. But no, it's actually really cool. I think if you're interested in Bible study, which if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are, you're going to enjoy just learning a little bit about the principles of typology. Do you know anything about typology?
Well, I think you're going to teach me a lot. I do know a little bit about typology, studying the Bible, and you run past that word every once in a while when you're reading a commentary.
Yeah, it comes up quite a bit, especially in modern scholarship that are doing biblical theology. Now, whenever I was studying this topic, I'll be honest, I read a couple of really good books on it and still had almost no clue what it was. And that's because I feel like the definitions that are out there, like I understood the principles of what you're supposed to do with it, but like why? I don't think that question was ever answered in those books, and that really troubled me. I feel like I know the answer to why now.
Are you asking, like, why does typology exist, or why? Well, like, what the purpose of it is?
Why does it work?
Why does it work?
How do we know? So, okay, let me just tell you what it is first on the top level. It's noticing patterns throughout Scripture, and those patterns they build, they are reused, they create further expectations that Jesus then steps into. So those patterns, those are the types. It actually comes from the Greek word tupos, and we're going to take a look at that in a minute. So typology is seeing escalating patterns throughout Scripture that Jesus steps into.
So can you give us like a modern day example that's outside the Bible of something that would be a typology?
Yeah. So let's take Hallmark movies. So in every single Hallmark movie, there is a girl looking for love. She finds a guy. She runs into some form of trouble. I don't know. They don't like each other for a minute or whatever. And then finally, she gets the guy and things are better than they could have been at the beginning.
And at the end, it's always snowing and they kiss.
Yes. Every single time. These movies hurt me. Anyway, that's what you can expect. And when you go to watch a Hallmark movie, if you're that kind of person, that's what you're looking for. You know that's going to be the storyline.
Yeah, there's always some comfort in knowing what's going to happen for people that like those kind of movies. I'm not one of those people. No.
If you are one of those people, you either really love the storyline or you love to watch and just kind of poke fun at all the things that you've already predicted. So that's on occasion.
I think that would be me. If I was watching Hallmark movies, I would be the guy that was annoyingly telling you what's going to happen next.
Yeah. On very, very rare occasions, Sarah will enjoy those kinds of movies, but the whole time we'll sit there and just poke fun at it. So at least it's kind of enjoyable.
Yeah.
But anyway.
So, you're saying that typology is like a Hallmark movie.
Yeah, you have watched, let's say you've watched 100 of these movies. You know exactly what's going to happen. There's been patterns that have created expectations that cause you to know what's come next and cause you to, just expect and look for the kind of fulfillment that you see in that movie.
Right.
Now, the complicated thing is here, if with the Bible, you see these patterns everywhere, and you see how a lot of these patterns, they stack up, and Jesus steps into them. Jesus is the fulfillment of these patterns. But the thing that some of these books never really explain to me is why. Like, obviously, it's working. Obviously, the author intends for us to do this, but how does he signal to us that this is the way he wants us to interpret his writings? Let me give you, an example.
Okay.
So we have, let's just take the theme of kingship. So we have Abraham, who is given promises of being a father of a multitude, being a nation of kings. So we have kingship in his promise and throughout his lineage. We get down to the kingship promise to Judah from Jacob. We get to people like David, and actually before that, you got Saul, and you got Solomon and all of David's line. And so there is this pattern where God's chosen person has kingly promises or kingly titles given to them. And so we expect when the Messiah comes, he's going to be kingly. He's going to be a king. So that is a typological pattern. Now, I understand there are actual promises of Jesus being in the kingly line of David, so there is that expectation. But let's just take the type, the pattern by itself. With the pattern of kingship, Jesus clearly steps into that pattern. He becomes a king. He also becomes a priest, and we see themes of priest throughout Scripture. We see patterns of serpent crusher throughout Scripture. We'll talk about some of these patterns more later. So let's just take that kingship and go back to Adam for a second. So Adam was portrayed as a king as well, and he's the first one in this pattern. But how do we know that after Adam we're supposed to expect this pattern in Yahweh's elect? Well, I think just like the Hallmark movie, there is a narrative expectation that is created within the story itself. It's the goal of the story itself. So I think the thing that has to be understood about typology is that it is born out of the first couple chapters of Genesis. First chapters of Genesis, God makes the world, and then on the seventh day he rests. That is a biblical way to say, and he lived happily ever after. That's it's the high point. Things are good. This is the beginning of the Hallmark movie where the girl's doing well and she's...
Yeah, and doesn't that idea of God resting on the seventh day, isn't that the same language that's used for like a king?
Yes.
Like resting into his throne room?
Yeah, I think David is said to have rest, or maybe it's Solomon, have rest on every side from his enemies.
Right.
More often it's applied to ancient Near Eastern mythologies where the gods will rest and take up their rule after. So it's about God's ruling, but yes, it's still that kingly...
Yeah, so we're given like seeds.
Yeah.
Like God is planting seeds at the very beginning in Genesis and the creation story.
Right, and so the creation story in chapter 1 and chapter 2, those portray the ideal situation of the world.
Right.
And so there are different kinds of stories. There's stories that the main character starts at the bottom and then has an exaltation. Trying to think of somebody like this. Star Wars. Anakin. He's a slave kid, and he becomes this great general and so on, whatever. Oh, Harry Potter's another one, actually. He's essentially in that same, basically a slave to his family, and he becomes a great exalted wizard. And then you've got people who, things are going well for them, and the story takes a big dip. Things go bad, and things get really great again. Like, I don't know, Frodo. I keep bringing up these nerdy movies when we make references. But... the Bible is one that starts out similar to The Lord of the Rings in that way, where everything is ideal at the beginning, and then you have the fall. So the whole story of the Bible is getting back to that ideal situation. How do we know that? Because we have the language about the serpent crusher, and then we have as Adam and Eve are leaving the garden through being given new clothes. We talked about this back in our episode on Genesis 3. I believe the second part of that episode, he is giving them priestly and kingly garments. He's reinstating them as the image. So right after Genesis 3, there are small promises and small signs that humanity is going to be reinstated. And that's the story of the rest of the Bible, following the select one that is going to crush the serpent and help humanity get reinstated into that ideal situation in the first couple chapters. So we are looking for someone that looks like Adam, and there's other aspects of the first couple chapters there that Jesus will step into, but we're looking for someone that looks like the ideal humanity, ideally with God, ruling in the way that Adam does as our messianic figure. I feel like I've seen a lot where people will just they'll notice a pattern halfway through the Bible, and then they see it a few more times, and look, there's this escalating pattern. This must be a typological prophecy. Well, maybe it is. We have to go back and evaluate that on its own. But I think the thing that really gives typology its roots is that we're looking for patterns of the garden in the story. Now, the next part of this is...
Wait, just a second. So What you're saying is, for it to truly be typology, biblical typology, the type actually starts in Genesis.
A lot of the time. There will be cases outside of that, but those need to be evaluated differently.
Okay.
Because you can pick up just, I noticed a little random pattern through these couple of books or whatever. It's typology.
Right.
It might be a false positive.
Right.
So slow down.
Gotcha. But you're saying the purpose of typology is to help encourage us to see God fulfilling his mission to redeem his world to the ideal.
Right. And so that's the next part of this is we're not only looking for patterns of things that are in the garden, but we're also looking for the patterns in which Yahweh works to bring people back to the garden.
Okay.
So what's something you see Yahweh do repeatedly in his plan to redeem humanity? He is repeatedly calling people out from the nations. He is repeatedly bringing them into his land, into his space.
Yeah.
He is continually making his elect one defeat enemies. He is repeatedly doing exoduses that we have seen in this book. We're repeatedly seeing atonement and sacrifices being kind of like on the climax of these exoduses. We see the two goats motif we've talked about. So we see all these ways which Yahweh acts repeatedly with different people, different times, different places, to bring people back into his space, to try and re-accomplish what he started in Eden. And so we're looking for Yahweh to act in a very similar way in Jesus, and we're looking for Jesus and Yahweh, same person, but we're looking for him to act in similar ways in the future at our final exodus and deliverance.
Okay, so for somebody on this side of the cross, we can look back at typology, and it can strengthen our faith because we can see God's overall sovereign plan from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you're an Old Testament follower of Yahweh, if you're able to see some of these typologies, if it would, instead of bolstering your faith like it does us, but it would almost like build the anticipation of what's coming.
I think it does the same for us, though, too.
Okay.
I think it's both and. We see
both and.
We see the patterns of how God interacts with Abraham and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and so on, and we start then we start to look further in the narratives, and we see, David and Solomon and so on. And so we have, just over and over and over again, God making the same promises, acting in the same way. And then we see those same promises, same actions, or at least same types of things happening in Jesus' deliverance of us. And so we can see this is how God is acting in the same way for the same goal, to deliver his people.
Right.
And so there's some things that Jesus didn't do yet, though. So, for instance, we're looking for the ultimate serpent crusher,
right? And
he disarmed the powers and authorities, and he disarmed Satan on the cross, but he didn't kill him, he didn't defeat him. And so we're still looking for, in that pattern, we're looking forward still, and it's informing our hope of how Jesus is going to come back and redeem us.
Gotcha. Yeah. Already not yet.
Right. And we're still looking for those things like, we know in the narratives of the Gospels that Jesus was exalted on the cross, that was kind of his enthronement scene, but we haven't actually seen Jesus on a throne in his land, which is the earth. He hasn't reestablished Eden, which is what a lot of these promises have pointed to. And so again, we're seeing more patterns throughout Scripture of him trying to reestablish that space where he is and seat his king on the throne. We're still awaiting that pattern to be fulfilled in Jesus in a physical sense.
Well, and that's really a good point, because that changes the narrative that most of us, I think, probably grew up with in the church, that when you die, you go off to heaven. and there's really no thought of heaven coming to earth. Like, that's not on most people's radar, but that is the biblical story from the very beginning of Genesis. You see that that's the ideal, and that's what God's bringing our world back to eventually.
Yeah.
And so, that's important.
Yeah, I think it's cool, too, that a lot of the typological patterns that we see in the Bible take place inside of the Exodus pattern. So that's why I think it's extra useful that we've been going through that in Genesis, because Yahweh continually uses the Exodus pattern and all that entails that we've already discussed on this podcast to bring an elect one out of the nations back into his land, and then using them to redeem the rest of the nations. And so along with that, usually our elect one goes through their own exodus. We've already seen that with Noah and with Abraham. We've talked about it with Lot, even though he's not the elect one. We're going to see that still with the rest of the characters in Genesis and Moses. Now, Jesus, he also goes through his own exodus. Quite a few, actually, where he goes down to Egypt and he gets called back out. And then there's also where he comes out of the waters with the Spirit descending on him, just like Israel and Adam and Noah were all brought out of the waters with God's breath and wind being present there. And then
comes out of the wilderness.
Yeah. And then he leads us in an exodus, just like Moses. He goes through exoduses, then he leads one.
Right.
And so in that, we should be expecting our final deliverance to look like that as well, at least fit the Exodus pattern. And it's really cool. There's a book by Brian Estelle called Echoes of Exodus, and he goes through just where Exodus shows up a lot throughout Scripture. I don't think he counts as many elements of the Exodus as we do in this podcast, but he does show how the Exodus shows up in Revelation, for instance.
Right.
And so, again, that same typological Exodus pattern is present all throughout Scripture and informs our future hope.
And so the typology of the Exodus becomes a major part of the narrative. Yeah, that'd be interesting. That's one thing I haven't really dove into, is just what does the Exodus look like in Revelation. That could be a whole other podcast, I feel like.
Maybe we should do that sometime.
That'd be fun.
I feel like I've actually been a little bit all over the place in trying to define it. I feel like I haven't given a concise
Okay, yeah, so let's do a quick review.
Yeah.
So how would you define what it is, and then separate that from the purpose of it?
Okay. Well, first of all, apologies for being all over the place so far. So typology is patterns of narrative expectations in the Bible as Yahweh brings about his ultimate goal of redeeming humanity. So the way it works is we have the ideal situation in the first couple chapters of Genesis. We have humanity and Yahweh together in the Garden of Eden and so on. Well, things go awry. It's not good. And so Yahweh will then act in a patterned way in each generation to bring about the state of Genesis 1 and 2 again. And we're looking at that pattern of the way that Yahweh acts to see how he will deliver. We're also going to look at the pattern in those events where Yahweh acts. How do humans respond? And so that's going to teach us things about, here's how humans typically respond according to this pattern, and here are the different responses that humans may get in those patterns. So, let me bring up 1 Corinthians 10:11 real quick, because this is going to give us an example of something that pertains to humans in typology, not just the way that Yahweh is acting. Before I do that, does that answer the question?
So just to try to summarize what you're saying here, typology, when you think of typology, you should be thinking of patterns, biblical patterns that start typically in Genesis and show and help to reveal God's overarching mission to redeem his world back to the ideal. Mm-hmm. So that's what they are.
Yeah.
And so the purpose of them, then, what would you say?
Oh, the purpose of typology is to give us, all sorts of things. So to start off, it shows us the consistent character of Yahweh. It shows us all the different responses that humans can have when they're interacting in this narrative pattern. But ultimately, as we see the way in which Yahweh wants to redeem humanity, it paints a picture of who the Messiah is going to be.
Okay, yeah.
So
that's kind of what I was thinking myself. That it provides this framework for us to be able to comprehend better what God is doing and why he's doing it, and what to anticipate the Messiah to be like.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so going back to the Genesis statement, there are some things that become part of the pattern after the initial Garden of Eden restoration pattern, because the big focus of typology, we know from the beginning chapters of Genesis that the beginning is the ideal. And so we're not just focusing on the state of the garden, but we're more so focusing on the pattern of Yahweh's work after that to get back to that state. And the fact that he works in the same way, and the fact that the narrative leads us to expect that that's where he's trying to get us back to, we want to pay attention to the patterns that Yahweh uses, because he's going to keep using those patterns to redeem.
So yeah, and I think God's wired us to see patterns. And so it's natural for these kind of patterns to be in the biblical narrative, because we're going to see them. It's almost like a highlighter. We've talked about like the number 7 is kind of God's way of bringing a highlighter to a passage to say, look at this.
Yeah.
And so these typological, I guess, threads that go through the narrative are very similar to that, and that they help highlight some major themes.
Yeah, you'll notice where a pattern gets repeated, and so you start to look at it and say, ooh, what's going to change this time so that I can learn about how this pattern works in a new scenario. And we've talked about this principle with the Genesis pattern already, so typology should feel very familiar for this audience.
Well, and it's helpful too, because we've seen this in Genesis already, where there's this very consistent pattern, and then all of a sudden when the pattern gets broken, that's even a red highlighter. Like there's something, what's going on there? Why is that there? Why is that different than what we expected to see? And so it's just it's a brilliant way for God to tell us the story.
Right. Well, and in that we see So just for example, we just got done with Lot. And so Lot, he is not one of the elect ones. He's actually one that gets painted more as the seed of the serpent as we go, even though he does have some loyalty to Yahweh. He continually messes up and tries to distance himself from the elect one. But God still, in the same way, delivers him through an exodus.
Right.
And so God remains consistent, and in that we see God's grace even on his non-elect. Right. And so that's the difference in that story.
Right.
But it highlights God's grace and consistency still.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the thing. In a lot of these patterns, the people change, God doesn't. And I think that's, at least it's significant. Paul actually picks up on this in 1 Corinthians 10. I'm going to start reading in, I think, verse 6.
Okay.
Yeah. So it says, "Now these things took place as an example, a tupos, a pattern for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and then rose up to play." That's a reference back to the golden calf incident. "We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day." That's a reference to the Balaam story in Numbers. "We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents when they were grumbling about food and just wanting to go back to Egypt, and nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer." And that's in Numbers 14. Similar situation. So he says again in verse 11, Paul says this in verse 6 and 11, "These things happened as an example," which is the Greek tupos, where we get typology. "These things happened as a pattern, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." So Paul is noticing, now human rebellion, that actually has been a pattern back since the garden. So he's noticing all the ways in which Yahweh consistently acts as humans are disloyal to him and not trusting as he's trying to rescue them. And so he notices this pattern within the Exodus motif where, kind of the Exodus motif, a lot of these examples take place in one big Exodus as they're coming into the Promised Land, but still throughout Yahweh's salvific work, he notices that humans rebel a lot, and when they do, it ultimately results in destruction and being cut off from his people. So he's saying this is a typological pattern that is an example for us that can help us learn. It can help warn us what happens if we decide to throw Christ off whenever we grumble over food or just over small things continue to be disloyal to Christ, or big things. When we decide to be disloyal to Yahweh, what happens? Well, there's a pattern and it's consistent, so we can learn from it.
So that's another purpose of typology, is to almost be a warning to us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think maybe to boil down what typology is and is for in just a couple sentences might not do it justice, because I think really typology, it's building a worldview as you see situations within the world take place in different ways, in different times, and with little variations that teach you new things. And so this pattern, you're supposed to see something happening again and again and again, and it becomes part of just your worldview, part of how you process information. When you see little variations, it teaches you something new about that world that you're building in your head. And so it doesn't just teach you what happens whenever you are disloyal to Christ and to Yahweh. It doesn't just teach you that Jesus is going to come as through an exodus for us. He's not just going to be a king, but it's building an entire worldview by using this pattern, expanding the pattern throughout time. And as the pattern keeps going, you get so used to it, little things can be added to it and subtracted from it, changed. So there's always new pieces of the puzzle being added.
Good deal. Any other thoughts on typology?
Again, I just want to repeat it one more time, that we begin with the ideal state in the garden, and then we're looking for the ways in which Yahweh and humans interact as Yahweh seeks to redeem his people, because that is the narrative tension of the story. We're trying to see the patterns along the narrative tension of the story. So I hope that is helpful, because I feel like I never had that told to me. It was just people noticing, hey, there's patterns here. Jesus kind of looks like this pattern, so it must be what we should expect, when it very well could be, why is this not a false positive? How do you know that this works besides the fact that it works? How is it not just a circular argument? So anyway, I hope that's helpful. If there's any other questions, I'd love to hear them, so reach out. Like I said, we've got our email in the description now, so reach out. But do you have any other question, thoughts, comments about typology?
What's the difference between an illustration and a typology? Like Jesus might use a parable as an illustration. Why is that not a typology?
It can be.
Okay.
So the parable of the wicked tenants. This is fresh on my mind because of the Gospel of Thomas episode that I just did. So in that, you have eventually the servants are brought in and they are killed, and some of them are sent back, depending on which one you're reading. Then the farmer says, I'm going to send my son, they'll respect my son. And they kill him as well and send him back. And so then he says, when the farmer comes, he's going to destroy these servants. That is actually a parabolic portrayal of a typological pattern, a theme throughout Scripture.
Okay, yeah.
And it's that, it starts with Joseph, like, here comes the elect one, and there's actually a link back to this story in that parable, because the brothers, they start grumbling and say, oh, here comes the heir, let's kill him. And so that's kind of where this pattern really takes root. But then throughout Scripture, you see Yahweh, in his attempt to deliver people, he's sending servants. He is sending Moses, he is sending the prophets, and they are often, initially at least, or maybe finally, rejected or killed. The prophets are killed throughout the Scripture, and Jesus says that much. We have with Moses, whenever he initially comes to deliver his people, they reject him because things are hard. You also have the seed of the serpents that continually reject the elect one throughout Genesis before Moses comes on the scene. And so there is this typological expectation that the elect one, God's chosen instrument of deliverance and covenant reminder, is going to be rejected and beaten or killed.
Okay, yeah. So I guess some of the things that are going through my mind are, some people would argue that if the New Testament doesn't mention the type, then
I like this one.
It's not a type, it's just an illustration.
Yeah. I think that we should remember that the New Testament is a relatively short explanation of the Old Testament.
Okay.
That's at least my thoughts on it.
Right.
Some people want to take the New Testament and say, this is the root of all we believe.
Right.
Rather, that is the growth of the root, which is the Old Testament.
Okay.
I think that we can sum up the New Testament as being fulfillment, explanation, or cultural application of the Old Testament.
Okay.
And so everything comes from the Old Testament. The Gospels primarily are trying to portray, according to the Old Testament expectations, who is Jesus? Why is he the Messiah? Yeah, that's what they're trying to explain. And they're also, showing some of his teachings and how he's reinterpreting some things, or not reinterpreting, but correctly interpreting some things in the Old Testament. Then you get into Acts. It's doing the same thing, trying to show how God's promises are coming true in the church. And these, again, there are patterned expectations in Acts as well. Then you get into Paul, and he is giving, and the other epistles as well, they're giving very specific application and instruction and doctrinal reminders to churches in specific instances. Now, did every single instance that can happen in the world happen in that Greek culture that the apostles addressed? No.
Right.
Our culture and our situation is very different. And so just on that, we should assume that the New Testament is kind of it's a case study that we can use as an example for how to correctly interpret the Old Testament. But the Old Testament is the meat. I think that's really important. Like, we need the New Testament to see who Jesus is. That's very critical. But the Old Testament is going to contain lessons that the New Testament isn't going to contain.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when people say things like, if the New Testament doesn't talk specifically about whatever that type or what you think is a type, then it's not actually a typology. It's more of an illustration. I think a lot of the heart behind that is that there is this tendency that I've seen to try to turn every Old Testament verse into something about Jesus. And so I think they're trying to protect us from going that route, but maybe they go a little bit too far with that to just eliminate. Like, if it's not talked about in the New Testament, then it's definitely should not be considered a typology.
Yeah, and there's typological themes that Matthew may pick up on that John doesn't, and John may pick on something that Matthew doesn't.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So they're not all inclusive.
Right,
and so,
for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be things that the Old Testament is going to portray as expectation about Jesus that just it's not talked about in the New Testament.
Right.
It doesn't mean it's not there, and it does mean that when we find something that we think is a new truth that the New Testament doesn't talk about, we should be very careful.
Sure.
Don't just run off into left field and like, ooh, I found something new.
Yeah.
Likely you didn't, because the Old Testament as well.
Yeah.
So the prophets are essentially what the epistles are to the Old Testament. They are specific cultural application of the covenants of Sinai and the Torah. And everything is just on repeat. It's these typological patterns, these same promises, these same sins and restorations on repeat throughout the Old Testament, applied in new ways to give us new ways to apply the truths and the consistency and the reliability, the loyal love from Yahweh.
Yes.
So you'd be hard-pressed to find, I think, new doctrine in any particular place. It's going to be something that is going to be on repeat throughout Scripture if you find something that's a real doctrine.
Right. Good word.
Cool. Well, a little bit of a tangent, but I think it was good.
Yeah, I think that should wrap it up.
All right. Sounds great. Hope this was helpful, everybody, and
we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.